Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jessica Kearney, and I'm Vice President for Public Policy here at the Travelers Institute, standing in for our host today, Joan Woodward. Welcome to our webinar series. We're so glad you're here with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to share our disclaimer about today's program. I'd also, as always, like to thank our wonderful program partners who help make this possible and join and promote to their members and networks and students. We have the Masters in FinTech program at the University of Connecticut School of Business, NAIA, or the National African American Insurance Association, the Metro Hartford Alliance, the Risk and Uncertainty Management Center at the Darla Moore School of Business, the Independent Insurance Agents and Brokers of America, or the Big I, the American Property Casualty Insurance Association, APCIA, and the Insurance Association of Connecticut. Welcome to all of you and your members. Okay, let's get started. So today we're going all in on cybersecurity. And as you might know, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and I am very proud to say that here at the Travelers Institute, our cybersecurity education extends all year round. So thank you for those of you who've joined us in the past and earlier through the year. Through our event series that we call Cyber, Prepare, Prevent, Mitigate, Restore, we help small and mid-sized businesses as well as public sector organizations improve their cyber readiness. And that will be the theme of today, as well as getting a real update on where we stand with the state of cybersecurity. We launched this series in 2016, and today I'm proud to say this marks our 73rd program, reaching tens of thousands of participants along the way, both in person and virtually. Throughout this initiative, we've made it a keystone to collaborate with government agencies who are tasked with defending our nation from cyber threats. One of those agencies is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, a relatively new agency under the US Department of Homeland Security. With that, I am honored to introduce today's speaker, who has held top leadership positions at both CISA and in the White House on the National Security Council. Jeff Greene is the former Assistant Executive Director for Cybersecurity at CISA. He is the former Chief of Cyber Response and Policy on the National Security Council and a Distinguished Fellow at the Aspen Institute, and we'll get to hear more about what he's up to these days as well. He has led the development of cybersecurity policy at the highest levels of our federal government, and he's here to share all of that information with us today and insights from his unique vantage point. He's been instrumental in constructing US cyber defenses against nation-state actors and has helped improve the cyber resilience of critical infrastructure here in the United States. We'll start out with a presentation from Jeff, and then I'll join on the other side for a discussion and, importantly, to take your questions. We've gotten literally hundreds of questions in already. Jeff, welcome so much to the program. I'm pleased to turn the floor over to you. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to open a bit by talking about the cyber threat landscape. First, who are the adversaries? We're looking at, there are obviously nation states out there. There are criminal gangs. That's what you see with a lot of the ransomware and other extortion attacks. Nation states that act as criminal gangs, and sometimes you have criminal gangs that can act on behalf of the nation states. And it's not always easy to know who is acting on a certain, why they're doing something, whether it is in fact a criminal gang that's being directed, or as I said, sometimes you'll have nation states that will masquerade as a criminal gang to try to hide who they are. So you also, unfortunately, do have some activist groups that are out there that can use cyber to try to gain either publicity for their campaigns, funding, or other events. Criminals can also have a pretty significant impact on our national security space. If you think back to 2021, that summer, there were a couple of big ransomware incidents. I think the one that folks probably remember the best was Colonial Pipeline in the mid-spring that year that shut down a pipeline that served most of the East Coast. But another one we dealt with in the White House a few weeks later around 4th of July was JBS Foods, and that created some stress about whether people were going to get their hot dogs and hamburgers for the 4th of July and what it was going to cost. So while, in the government, we are primarily focused on the nation states, we're very much aware that these criminal gangs can have a big impact on our national and economic security as well. I think for many of you on the phone, you're probably mostly going to be dealing with criminal gangs, whether through business email compromise, ransomware, or other extortion activities. But I encourage you to think also about the potential a nation state activity could have on some of your customers and clients, and I'll get into that a little bit. When we talk about nations, the big four is the way we talk about it. We have Russia, China, Iran, and DPRK, North Korea. So starting with Russia, Russia historically was seen as one of the most sophisticated cyber adversaries out there. They were very stealthy, very effective, focused on both espionage and disruption. And when I talk about disruption, I mean the ability to break physical things, to stop machinery, to change settings and devices in the real world. And Russia was very active in both of those fronts. Since their invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they've been very focused on that conflict. So we haven't seen as much activity, but you still need to think about them, particularly in the espionage. In the lead up to the war, I was in the White House, and we were extremely concerned about the potential for Russian disruption of critical infrastructure in the West if we ended up in a war and sanctioning them. So their capabilities are pretty significant. Iran is historically less sophisticated, but two things. Number one, they are getting much better. Their effort, they've put a lot of money into it over the past 10 to 20 years and have improved dramatically. But one important thing to think about in cyber is you don't have to be that good to create significant problems. If you think back about 10 or so years ago, there were denial of service attacks on many major US banks, which were thought to be an Iranian retaliation against a reported US and Israeli activity against Iranian nuclear facilities. And that was unsophisticated, but it was very effective. And one thing I like to say in cyber, there's a saying that we don't want to be fighting the last war. Unfortunately, in cybersecurity, we need to continue fighting the last war because the vulnerabilities that our adversaries can exploit persist. So we need to fight both the last war and the next war at the same time. The DPRK, North Korea, is largely focused at stealing money. That's a lot of what they do, not all of it. They do have some espionage and disruption activity regionally, but primarily they are a nation state that acts as a criminal gang through ransomware and other scams designed to fund their weapons program. One of the least known but big moneymaker for them is fake IT worker scams, where they will place workers in companies and collect their salaries, and also gives them the capacity to conduct disruptive or ransomware attacks there if they want. But I'm going to spend most of my time drilling down on China, the PRC. Historically, they were thought to be very active, but also very noisy, relatively easy for defenders to detect. In the past 5 to 10 years, they have improved dramatically. We talk about them as a near peer adversary. They are very quiet. They also have an enormous operation, dwarfs anything we have in the West. It's hard for us sometimes to get our mind around it. They also have a very significant pipeline for training new cyber operators, both in the military and elsewhere. I saw an article a couple weeks ago. The top 10 research universities in the world, there's Harvard, and then there are 9 in China. So they have a pretty strong capacity to train new experts. And the Chinese are active in both disruption and in espionage. So I'm going to bring up, first talk a little bit about disruption. This is a campaign that CISA and our partners in the US government and around the world first reported on in early 2023. This is the banner of the advisory we put out, but there's been a lot of reporting since then. Generally, this is referred to as Volt Typhoon. That is a Microsoft label that kind of stuck. So we in the government ended up using it, even though we had our own descriptors of what these folks were doing. And they have burrowed deeply into critical infrastructure across the United States and have the capability to launch destructive cyber attacks at their time of their choosing. Our belief is it would be in the run-up to a conflict. In the Director of National Intelligence Threat Assessment in 2023 and 2024, she described the why, and I'm quoting here. These attacks would be designed to deter U.S. military action by impeding U.S. decision-making, inducing societal panic, and interfering with the deployment of U.S. forces. And if you think back to the Colonial Pipeline incident I talked about, in that summer, there were runs on gas stations, even though the pipeline and the government and everyone else was saying, we will not have a gas shortage. Ultimately, we did, but it was caused by panic, not by a problem with the pipeline. There were videos and images of people filling garbage bags with gasoline, which is obviously incredibly unsafe, led to public service announcements saying, don't put your gasoline in a trash bag, but it happened. So our adversaries see that and they understand how they can use cyber effects operations to create panic among the U.S. population. When I was at CISA, we found and eliminated this threat actor, Volt Typhoon, in a variety of different sectors, including aviation, energy, water, telecommunications. So you can draw from that the type of disruption they could have caused. And they take advantage of devices that are widely used and unfortunately are deeply insecure to gain access to their targets. And because of this and because of other information, we have high confidence that what we found is just the tip of the iceberg. And moreover, we have very low confidence about whether we can keep the adversary out of these systems if they make a really diligent effort to get back in. So once they get on, they use techniques where they're basically taking advantage of tools that are on these systems so they look like normal users. It's incredibly hard to find them, and it's easy for them to hide and go silent. As I said, we have found them in a variety of places and have come up with techniques, but they're always evolving. What concerned us the most about Volt Typhoon, though, is the targets that they were going after. These were operations that had no value from an intelligence collection standpoint. The only reason that you would take over or pre-position on these systems is so you can cause disruption when you want to do it. And that was particularly worrisome. That was new to us and what led to a fairly robust government response to it. But the Chinese are also pretty actively engaged in espionage. What I put up here is an advisory that came out late last year from a group, also the Microsoft name known as Salt Typhoon. Salt Typhoon compromised some of the major wireless providers in the United States and were able to get on their networks in a place where they could collect data on the activity of millions of different devices, phones, iPads, tablets, etc. And if they could correlate device to a person, they were in a place where they could actually collect data as it transited to and from that device. So if you were not using encrypted communications and if you were one of the few people targeted, they could collect off of your phone. They also broke into the back end of some of the systems that the providers used for cooperating with law enforcement when they're served with subpoenas or other information, and were able to steal a fair amount of data from there. This was particularly illuminating for me. We started to get hints of something going on when I was at CISA, and it was terrifying but educational to see how our understanding of a campaign this significant evolved. It was literally changing hour by hour as we got different breadcrumbs and worked with different partners. But it was also really rewarding to see how government worked across agencies. We were at CISA, we're regularly in touch with the intelligence components, with FBI, with others, and we really teamed up to take advantage of what resources each agency and what relationships each agency had. There was none of the territoriality that I had seen in government when I was in the Hill 10 to 15 years ago. The partnership with the private sector was also particularly good in a few cases. Verizon in particular deserves an enormous amount of credit. They were a victim, but they were also incredibly forward-leaning in helping the government to understand what was going on and to respond to it. So this brings me to the question of what can we all do? How do we make ourselves more secure? And starting with at the corporate level, at the top level, we need to start by improving our technology. We have to expect more out of the technology we use. And I think back to a conference I went to when I first started on cybersecurity about 15 years ago, and not because of anything I learned there, but because of a t-shirt I saw somebody wearing, and it said, "There's no patch for a stupid user." And I thought that was really funny, and I came back and I told all my colleagues about it, and I still think it's a little funny. But as I got into this, I realized that concept, that mindset is coming at this problem entirely backward. The problem isn't that people are going to click on a link or open a document or do whatever. All of us will do that. There have been con games from the beginning of time. The problem is that we are relying every day and in every possible way on software and hardware and technology that was built with flaws that allow bad actors to take these very human mistakes and turn them into these broad compromises and steal someone's life savings or breach a corporate network or disrupt the water, the transportation, aviation I talked about, or steal our national security secrets. It's like we're buying cars that have known but undiscovered deadly defects. And we know that the manufacturer may or may not fix it depending upon how their quarter has gone. We would never accept that with machinery or technology, but we've come to accept it with software, and we need to get past that. So when I was at CISA, we were pushing this Secure by Design initiative. I'm really pleased that this webpage is still up. The new administration has, if not using the same words, has been pushing this concern about insecure devices. It is the foundational way that we can get ourselves more safe. And what we were really asking vendors to do is build in some basic security into the things they're building, things that we have known for decades will prevent intrusions. There's a class of defects that have been labeled the unforgivable vulnerabilities, and that term is 20 years old, and you still see those vulnerabilities being shipped in new products today. So as I said, the new administration is still going forward with Secure by Design, and I hope you all will get behind that as best you can, whether with your vendors or even with your policymakers, letting them know that this matters. But individuals can also be part of this. So, one thing I like to close with is letting people know what they can do to make themselves more secure. There are things you can do in your personal life. Most of us will never be targeted by a nation state. So if you do the basics in security, if you patch and update your software, if you use a VPN, if you have some type of security suite, if you're careful about links you click on, a little bit of healthy skepticism, you can make yourself secure against 99% of the bad guys out there. Because the old saying is if you're being chased by a bear, you don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than the next person. And if you do these things, you will be locking your doors. So when the criminal's going down the digital street, they'll knock on your door, it's locked, and they'll go to your neighbor. So I want to end with that point that don't take from anything I've said that things are helpless or hopeless. You can secure both yourself and your organizations. And things like what we're doing today, Travelers Institute for putting this on, are the way that we can all improve a bit. But thanks again. I look forward to conversation and any questions you all might have.
Jeff, thank you so much for that opening presentation. I think you absolutely set the serious tone of the conversation today and the things at hand. And certainly you talk about all the different sectors. You named aviation, energy, water, telecoms, all those things that intersect with our US critical infrastructure. But I also appreciate your last point just on, not all is hopeless. There's things that we all can do. And I know we'll dig into that in the hour ahead on this program. And I also appreciate the call out for the bright spot of the private sector collaboration, and appreciate everyone dialing in today to do their part from their respective organizations as well. So Jeff, just off the top here, I mentioned your impressive and extensive experience across the federal government and beyond. But I feel like even in those few words, we'll probably only scratch the surface. And I'm wondering if you can help share with our audience a little bit more about your background and where your career started in cybersecurity, to give us a little bit more of a color of where you've come from.
Sure. I was actually on the Hill working. I was a lawyer, and then I ended up in government working on the Hurricane Katrina investigation, 2005. And I migrated to a few different jobs where I was focused on counterterrorism and homeland defense. And in 2009, really randomly, one of my colleagues asked if I could help out on one small piece of a cyber bill because I was a lawyer and they needed a lawyer. And within a month, I had transitioned all of my other issues away and was working cybersecurity full time. So it was an interesting time. In 2009, cybersecurity was very important from a security standpoint, but not well understood in really the government or the private sector. So I still feel like a newbie to this when I work with people like Rob Joyce, my old boss, Ann Newberger, and others, but I've seen the evolution of this from a back burner issue to a front burner national and economic security issue. And the one little anecdote I'll say in terms of how much this changed, the legislation I was working on in 2010 through 2012 would have created an organization like CISA. But the big debate we had was, should it be a cybersecurity only agency or should it be cybersecurity and physical infrastructure? And we landed on just cybersecurity because if it was combined with the physical side, no one would care about cyber because no one wants to think about it. Today, CISA has both a cyber and physical mission, but very few people, if they know of CISA, even know that there's a physical security mission either. So we've come complete full circle just in that time.
And actually on CISA, and I gave a kind of a brief overview in my opening comments, but I know from the Travelers Institutes, and we've hosted cybersecurity education programs all across the country. And we, at every program invite a local CISA representative to talk about their capabilities and how they partner with business. I'm wondering, oftentimes we will go and see businesses in the area who haven't heard of CISA yet. So I'm just wondering if for our audience, you might take 1 minute and kind of give a little bit of history of CISA and their mission.
Sure. So CISA as an organization stood up in November of 2018, bipartisan legislation signed by Trump during his first term in office. It took parts of cybersecurity offices that were already in DHS, consolidated them and created the way we referred to it as an operational agency. Before that, the Office of Cybersecurity, and I'll spare you the acronym, sat near the front office of DHS, and it lacked the ability to work as directly with the private sector and with other agencies. They had that effort, but it was not the same. So it stood up. And where CISA differs from other federal agencies who are equally important and very essential to our national security in cyberspace is that CISA is team defense. The only mission that CISA has is defending either federal networks or assisting in defense of critical infrastructure or helping companies and developers understand their vulnerabilities. That is what CISA's mission is. So we have a lot of different divisions, but kind of the big ones that stick out for this call. One is defending federal civilian executive branch, the FCEB. Every agency is in charge of their own defense, but CISA provides resources, funding, and an overwatch, which since the SolarWinds attack in 2020 has become very sophisticated. When I was there, I was seeing us detect and prevent sophisticated nation state intrusions that we would have missed 2 and 3 years before.
Wow.
For the benefit of the folks on this call and your customers and clients, CISA has a regional workforce of both protective security advisors and cybersecurity advisors, and they can assist organizations with improving their own security, understanding the threat landscape. Sometimes they will be out knocking on your door. We have the capacity to sometimes see ransomware. I keep saying we, I mean CISA. I guess the old habits die hard. Often are able to see ransomware attacks as they're beginning or evolving. And the hardest thing is not to stop them, it's to get someone at these companies or organizations to trust us and even to pick up the phone sometimes. But by the time I left, we had stopped in the thousands of ransomware attacks. Some were on the verge of launching, some were just beginning their efforts.
Well, I know when we have our have the regional cybersecurity advisors through CISA at our programs, that's always one of the biggest takeaways we hear in attendee feedback is I'm so thankful to have met in person somebody at CISA that I can now call or reach out to and ask questions to, do tabletop exercises, all of that. So we saw that very much on our end as well. So you mentioned your time in the White House and National Security Council at CISA. What's it like getting the call to serve your country really at the highest levels on an issue like this at a moment when cyber is at the forefront of national security?
I mean, for me, the first thing that happens is the imposter syndrome kicks in. You know, my assumption is that there's someone who can do it better and they can find someone who's better, but you get past that. I used to joke I would never hire anyone who didn't have a bit of imposter syndrome. But it was very humbling when I went to the White House in February of 2021. So I was a career employee at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and I was detailed down, so a fully career role. Never imagined that we would be working on something like, preparing for a ground war in Europe. And then fast forward to when I went to CISA, the idea of stepping in to manage this division of 1,200 people on the day-to-day was both terrifying and exciting. And I had really come in the years I'd been in the White House and after to appreciate not the top level work that CISA did, but the kind of stuff you're talking about, the small engagements, either with a small agency in the federal government or with companies across the country. When we started preparing for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were extremely worried about, very credibly worried about the possibility that Russia might try to sabotage critical infrastructure in the U.S. And we worked with companies. CISA really led that charge. And in White House, we were kind of the encourager, but CISA did the work with FBI, with individual agencies, EPA, et cetera. But what we saw was companies and agencies coming together to do things that years before they would have said, not that they would not do, but they could not do. Suddenly, when there was a very real threat, the barriers came down and we dramatically improved security, and we did not see any Russian efforts to go after our critical infrastructure even after the sanctions went in place. And I believe that part of that was because they weren't sure what was going to work because we had done such an effective and public job in pushing our security levels up. But yeah, I mean, it was I still kind of hard to believe that I was there doing these things, but it was the honor and privilege of a lifetime, and I would go back into government in a heartbeat.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us and the imposter syndrome. I think we talk a lot about kind of leadership and management and our programs as well. So that's a really insightful window. And so you just mentioned some of the really critical work that was happening during your time in these positions. And clearly we're all seeing cyber in the headlines day in and day out. And you mentioned some of that in your opening presentation. Could you go a little bit deeper on some of those instances from your work at the White House and with CISA that still really resonate with you?
Yeah, the thing that I always try to stress to people, well, two things. One, where I ended, which is you at an individual level for yourself and for whatever organization you work for have the ability to influence and improve the security of yourself and your organization. So never think it's too hard or you can't do it. And that kind of leads to the first thing is that the movies and TV has created this image of the hooded hacker sitting at a computer typing away with someone else on the other end, sometimes countering it. There is technology involved in a good exploit, but there is often at least as much, if not more, psychology. So it is the human element of these compromises. So what we are seeing evolve is often how the criminals and other adversaries are going to trick someone into doing something they would not otherwise be able to do, as opposed to come up with some new novel effort on how to hack. And when I talked about the unforgivable vulnerabilities, the reason those still work often is because you're able to get a human to download a piece of software, click on a link, go to a web browser. The
Mhm.
caveat, though, the one thing I need to amend, and I have been amending how I talk about this, because this effort that I talked about with Volt Typhoon, I didn't use these words, but the edge devices, these routers and you can look at CISA's website to see the alerts for the different companies that have manufactured these devices and look at what we've done across the federal government. That is the more classic television hacking in the sense that they don't actually need to trick a human. Some of these devices, we believe that our adversary knows how these things work and were built better than the people who designed them. So they know where all the flaws are. So every time we find and patch one, they can go to another one. And what they're effectively doing is just logging in using usernames and passwords that are out there. They're not having to trick people. That is a different and much harder problem to solve. And we get at that through the Secure by Design. So interestingly, as I think about your question, the evolution I've seen is to some degree moving back towards the stereotypical TV and movie version of how these attacks are happening. And that's what we need to get at long term. And the only thing we as individuals can do is demand better from our policymakers and from our manufacturers.
There anything, just kind of following up on that devices piece of what you said, is there anything that consumers can do when they're purchasing these devices in terms of knowing what to purchase or the level of safety?
Yep. If you can do a little bit of research, and here's where if you use AI, Chat GPT effectively and intelligently, you can make good use of it. I recently bought new routers for my house, and I was using it to compare different brands. And also, I knew which ones I wanted to stay away from having been in government, but I used it to pull up, tell me the security specs of these, let me know how it works. So you can do some quick research. You should look at what data the devices collect. Also, make sure when you set up a device, if it has a default password, if it comes with one, make sure you change that immediately. It is shocking how often that those are still unchanged. Check to see if there are automatic updates, and if you see them, patch them. One thing, if you want to get a little more in the weeds, and this may sound a little counterintuitive at first, but you can look on these government websites, the It's called the Known Exploited Vulnerability, the KEV, or the CVD, the Common Vulnerability Database. See how many vulnerabilities a company has self-reported. And the more you see, the more likely you should use that company's products. Because what that tells you, assume all of them have vulnerabilities.
Right.
The good companies are the ones that are looking for them and fixing them. And for Secure by Design to work, we knew there would be a spike initially in self-reported, and we saw that in some of the companies that pledged. But that was leading to two things. One, fewer vulnerabilities in the products that are out there, and two, a belief that they're not building those vulnerabilities in the future. When I was in the White House, we worked on an executive order that tried to create a pilot program for like a consumer label. It's really hard to do, and it'd be voluntary. There's some efforts out there. You can look for that. Most of those will focus on the privacy settings. And the other thing, this is going to sound hard, but also trust your government a bit. Like when we're warning about devices or products or applications, there's usually a reason why. I mean, I'll mention TikTok. Um, Whatever is going on in the back end, one of the things that concerned me about TikTok is it was collecting more information from your device than it really needed to be effective at what it was doing. And that was a red flag to me as to why it would do that.
That's helpful. And the piece you shared about being counterintuitive, the more reporting of the different threats, that's fascinating and something important to think about. You mentioned in your opening presentation the big four and the countries that you see some of the threats coming from. You talked a little bit about the threat landscape. Are we seeing similar threats? Have they changed in the very recent last year or two, including methods? I know you talked a little bit about that. I'm wondering if you could dig a little bit deeper. I know you mentioned the fake job applicants. I think to our business audience here, I'm sure that's something that definitely makes their ears perk up.
Yeah, the job scams are something that is unfortunately not super new, but becoming better known. I think back to pre-COVID, my wife was a software developer, and I remember saying to me, I think we hired someone, and then someone else showed up for work, and she described the situation where they did all video and audio interviews, and they had someone who was very good. Uh, Fluent English speaker, not a native, but very fluent, knew all the technology. Great, they hired them. Day one, this person shows up, barely spoke English, and did not know how to use any of the tools that the interviewer or interviewee had said. So that was, and I remember she said it was a different person. I'm like, that couldn't have happened, but that is actually a very active scam. And it can lead to a lot of problems, not the least of which is you're paying money often to these North Korean individuals who are captive workers, and almost all the money goes to the government. But you also now have a verified authorized user on your system who is can log in, could be a launch point for a ransomware or other attack. So that type of human operation, and the North Koreans are very smart and adept at figuring out how to break in. The cryptocurrency, the use of cryptocurrency theft, and the way people are using it has in two ways really hypercharged crime, both stealing cryptocurrency because it's so valuable, but also it is allowed for these ability to transact. Like you can't use a credit card to pay off a crime, but you can use cryptocurrency. The evolution, though, that you asked about, the biggest thing for me is the shift towards these living off the land and edge device attacks, where unfortunately the attackers don't have to rely on human frailty as much as they used to. Well, human frailty in the sense of an individual, the human frailty they're taking advantage of is that these devices aren't being built well or patched well. Um, I wish there had been more evolution. The reality is that most attackers do not have to evolve much. And that's why we see the same type of vulnerabilities.
Going back to the fake job applicants, and that's a fascinating story from that you just shared with us. What can businesses do to protect themselves?
Yeah, the first thing I'd encourage you, the FBI has some great resources, and we talked about CISA's regional offices. Also, get to know who your regional FBI team is because they can be incredibly responsive and helpful if something comes up. Um, you have to revert to kind of the old school verification of employees, use the database, have some background checks in place, know where the scams likely are coming from. Unfortunately, you can't use a ton of technology in the initial interviews because they have laptop farms that can be in the US or elsewhere. So it looks like you're interviewing someone in that location. But really educate yourself on what the latest techniques and tools are. And the old cliche is if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If someone
Yeah.
who perfectly suits your needs pops up and is willing to work for below market value, it might not be the bargain you think it is.
Yeah. You mentioned a few times just tricking a human frailty. We have a bunch of questions coming in. One of them from Lindsay in California. She wants to know wire fraud and social engineering is plaguing my clients and their clients. Is there any way to stop the attempts?
So I hate to say no, but it's kind of a no. You definitely can't stop the attempts. The best thing you can do is educate the people on what's coming in. The wire fraud, the phrase you'll see in the law enforcement reporting of business email compromise. It's usually not emails anymore. Um, Human like education there is essential. There is a debate in the cybersecurity world about whether education is effective, and people throw around statistics of the limited percentage 10, 15, 20 you actually improve. I personally view that as a pretty big success. If we can string together a variety of different tools that can educate 10, 15% of people at the time, then we're going to put some security. So when you're talking about educating people is make sure your clients know that what criminals thrive on is that sense of urgency. They're pushing you to do something before you stop and think. And one of the ways to prevent that is to have procedures in place on the back end that don't allow things to happen that quickly.
Yep.
Pick up the phone, do an out of band communication. When I was at a think tank, I got a text on my personal phone from someone claiming to be from a government agency. And I did a little research, and in fact, it was. And the reason they were contacting me out of band was they were concerned that the networks on my employer were compromised. Thankfully, they weren't. But don't just use the type of communication you get. And also, if someone emails you an attachment, don't reply to it and say, was this really you? Because you're probably then communicating with the adversary, with the attacker at that point in time. Pick up the phone, go old school, or send a text. So the question was, are there ways to stop them? There's really no good ways to stop the efforts. What you have to do is put in layers of defense that will catch it different steps along the way.
Just tagging on to that, we have another question coming in from Kathleen in California. How should organizations establish out-of-band communication? And how do we effectively train executives alongside those incident response teams to to bake that in on the front end?
Um, Personal phones is usually the best. It depends upon how there's no simple single answer because it depends upon how the organization is structured. If everyone's using BYOD and your personal phone is your work phone number, it's not
Mm.
going to be as easy. But it is good to have, whether through Gmail or otherwise. A lot of times it's going to be if you know someone a bit out of work, but it is good to have that procedure in place so you have a separate way to communicate. In the government, when we were worried about some compromises at one point, a while ago, like we issued separate phones to everyone, so they had the capacity to do a third way of communicating beyond personal and your traditional work phone. Executives are a really tough nut to crack because their time is so limited. And in my experience, the way to get through to them is when you can give them very concrete examples concisely and make it feel very real. And that bore out, I think, in the Ukraine war prep time. The reason we were able to do things both with government executives and private sector executives was because all of a sudden it felt real. But simplify it as much as possible for the executives is what I would say, and make sure you get in touch with whatever support staff they have. They need to know it equally well. The last thing I'd say, and this is true both for individuals in a company and for their security team, you have to have a culture where it's okay to question. Because if someone's afraid they're going to get slapped down for saying, is this really you? You're more likely to have a culture where that wire is going to go out because the person was afraid of the response. And the security teams need to be able to go in and say, sir, you can't do this, ma'am, you can't do that, without fear of retribution.
I think that's a really critical point, and I'm glad you took a few minutes on that because we've gotten just a bunch of questions coming in around how do you convince people that the threat is real. So thank you for sharing those. So I just continuing down this thought about some of the things that we all see and interact with every day. So I feel like I'm getting multiple texts a day from numbers that I don't recognize, asking
Yeah.
to grab lunch, telling me I've got parking tickets with a DMV. What are we supposed to do about that?
The famous "Hi, how are you?" texts that keep coming
Yeah.
in. Yeah, I get several of them a day. Actually, I wrote a piece about this in a Substack that I call Cyber Shorthanded to try to simplify cyber issues. And what you can't really stop them. Apple and Android have gotten better at creating some filters, although paradoxically, some of the European privacy regulations have made it hard to put those filters in place. So ideally, if those filters go in place, you'll be seeing fewer of them. But the most important thing is to do nothing. Do not respond at all, because once you engage, you're, number one, encouraging the people on the other end, and number two, you can start a chain of communication you don't want. There's a great video of, I think his name's James Veach, of someone who engaged with one of these stereotypical Nigerian scams, and it's funny, but that won't come out as well for most of you. The other thing to understand about these is at the back end, and this is what I wrote about. Human trafficking is at the core of a lot of these scams. There are people who are trafficked into these boiler rooms and are required to meet quotas of the number of people they scam. And there's nothing, unfortunately, any of us at this end of it can do except try to ignore it to take out the profit margin. One of the I'm out of practice, but one of my favorite lines for dealing with cyber criminals is it is a business, and we need to drive up the cost of doing business. The harder you make it for them to connect, the more you drive up the cost of doing business.
Yeah. That's great advice. And thank you for mentioning your Substack. I think we just dropped that in the chat, so I'd encourage everyone to take a look. I think I was reading through some of your recent posts. I think just putting everything in plain English for people to understand. I think it was fascinating, eye-opening. I'm wondering if you could share any comments on the current state of CISA within DHS. We know the federal government is tightening its belt, cutting spending across agencies. What are your thoughts today?
Uh, in a word, concerned. I worry that we have lost a significant volume of particularly young cyber talent that my predecessors had brought in. At the leadership level, I think CISA has done well. The nominee for director is terrific. The person who's in place who has my job as EAD of cyber is fantastic. What worries me is that Nick and Sean don't have the tools that I had, because a lot of young talent has left and more folks are leaving. We talked about the cybersecurity advisors and the protective security advisors. There are far fewer of them than there used to be. And those people, whether the advisors or the people in HQ, were already pretty significantly overworked given the threats to federal networks, the Salt Typhoon, and the others. So I am confident that as of fairly recently, having talked to friends there, the quality and rigor of the work is still up there. It's still really good, but people are really tired and they need some relief, because you can't go at the pace that they've been going at, particularly losing people forever. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to track a specific incident to a cut here or a cut there, but it'll happen. It is, and I start where I finished, is that some of the really young talent that had been recruited to the mission. You're taking a significant pay cut as a fluent Chinese cyber expert to come work for the US government as opposed to one of the big cyber companies, but you do it for the mission and for the appreciation. And we've lost a lot of those people. And as I said, I have a ton of confidence in the leadership now. I just hope they can get the tools to keep the mission going forward.
That's helpful color. Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. And with your such unique vantage point as formerly being within CISA. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're up to today? What are you working on now?
Sure. So I'm writing my Substack. It's the first time in I can remember where I don't have anyone telling me what I can and can't say. So I'm able to share some of my core views. I've set up a consulting practice with a former colleague of mine from the White House, and we do some of the things you talked about. Is we help organizations, both local government and companies, take a hard look at what their security practices are, where
Mhm.
they can improve, kind of starting with what is the threat unique to your organization, and then are you meeting it where it is today and where it's going? And as I said before, it's important that in cyber we have to both fight the last war because those vulnerabilities persist, but we have to be ready for the next evolution. So we try to help companies and other organizations be ready to do that. And then the last thing we try to do is translate it into simple terms. If
Mhm.
we're working with a chief information security officer, help them understand here are ways you can present it to your board or leadership to make sure they understand the importance of what you're doing. And it's been rewarding and interesting. I've kind of pulled together my work as a lawyer, my work in the private sector, and the work in government. But a lot of it really comes down to the human side, the messaging, simplifying it so people can get it and it becomes personal, as I said. But it's a new challenge. I've never started anything like this. And luckily, it's going pretty well for now. But, tomorrow's a new day.
Yeah, oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And you mentioned the importance of simplicity. And we're just going to pull up a slide. These are the five cyber resilience best practices that I know we talk about at a lot of our cyber education programs. I'm wondering if there's any color or commentary you want to put in on any of these five best practices for cyber
I mean,
defense.
when I was talking to y'all before this, like you hit for the cycle here with the most important ones. But particularly having the incident response plan on there because too many organizations don't. The only footnote I'd add there is make sure you do even a basic exercise with that incident response plan. I was working with a fairly big organization a week or two ago who got an email from a criminal gang that said, "We own your data, deal with it. You're going to have to pay us." And they had an IR plan, but their first few minutes of panic were so intense that they didn't pull it out. So partner like, what does your IR plan say to do? And it gave them that first step. And once they went down that first step, everything flowed more smoothly. It was still terrifying. It was busy. It was crazy. But knowing what to do, having a little bit of muscle memory is essential.
Yeah,
So I was so pleased to see that you guys have that. And I encourage everyone to, and it can be super basic. You can get ChatGPT to write you a basic incident response plan. There are free ones out there that some of the big cybersecurity companies put out. But that's where knowing your cybersecurity advisor, your local FBI, you can cut off minutes that can help lower the cost of a recovery.
that's really helpful. And I think just very practical for everyone in the audience. And speaking of, I want to get in some audience questions because they're flowing in. Many of them having to do with AI, which you've mentioned several times throughout the course of the last hour. Um, can you offer your perspective on AI opportunities as well as concerns when it comes to cybersecurity? I know you've recently written about
Yeah.
some interesting facets of this.
So I am a late convert to AI. I was very skeptical of it when it first came out. And I was, first time I ever used it was before I was going to moderate a panel on it. And I figured I better know what this is. And I was blown away in the capabilities, but I still didn't really get to using it that much. But now I think the one thing I would say, I'm skeptical of this AI is going to solve every problem we've ever had in society. And at the panel I moderated, I said, tell me what AI is going to help us do that's new, not a different version of what we're doing today. And don't tell me it's going to cure cancer. So I think what AI can help us do is a lot of the work we're doing more efficiently. In the current state of AI, I think it is very much benefiting the defenders, not the attackers. It's always a cat and mouse game, but I think used effectively, AI is still going to be a force multiplier for defenders. The flip of that is you need to be incredibly suspicious of anything, particularly the public large language models tell you. You can use it very targeted for yourself in an organization where you've built your own narrow model. But I used AI. The story you mentioned is I was writing something and I wanted an example of where CISA had partnered with a company to do what we call a responsible disclosure of vulnerability. And I said, write me up an example. And it spat out this beautiful example. And I read it, and it was describing activity that supposedly happened when I led the cybersecurity division at CISA. And I'd never heard of this company. I'd never heard of the cybersecurity advisor, the advisory, and I had to approve them all that. So I said, is what you just told me true? And it came back, and what it said was, I pulled up some of the quotes. The cybersecurity bulletin, which was based on a fabricated example, is likely incorrect and led to an error. And then it talked about the fabricated cybersecurity advisory from CISA does not exist. And I was so taken aback. I just like shut down. I'm done. I'm going to write something. And then I got angrier and I went back And I actually asked it, why did you do this? Why did you give me fake examples? And the answer was basically, I couldn't find anything good, so I wanted to give you something. So I made
Incredible.
it up and I made it look like something real. I quote, I fabricated a specific example and I hate this first person of a computer, but still, I fabricated a specific example. And my takeaway from that, as a child of the Cold War, President Reagan was fond of trust but verify. And my tagline is never trust and always verify. And coincidentally,
Mhm.
a friend of mine had told me a week or two before, huge AI fan, but he said no matter what he searches, the next question is always, is what you told me true? Because that will force it to go back and check. And I do that regularly now, and it regularly corrects what it does. So if you're using AI intelligently, you can have great success with it, but you really, really, I knew intellectually not to trust it, but it drove it home for me. And I since then, I think I was looking for a flight and it told me a flight that didn't exist.
Wow.
And I mean, it's so, and it's on different models. I think from an organizational standpoint, if there's one tip I have for you all as you're working with your clients and customers, ask them whether they have put clauses in the contracts with their vendors on what they can do with their data. Because if you're not careful, you're ending up putting proprietary data into a training model. And I've seen that happen with a few folks with whom I've worked. So as I said, personally, I'm a huge convert now, but I'm incredibly skeptical, and I don't know how I'll ever trust it. And we're talking now about what people call agentic AI, and that will be a future blog post. Like we call it agentic AI, and we make it hard to understand what it is. It's AI that will make decisions and do things. I don't know when I'll ever get comfortable with this AI doing things as long as we have these so-called hallucinations happening so regularly. So it has to be very narrow, tailored uses. But footnote or last one, it's here. We have to learn how to deal with it effectively. We can't try to uninvent it.
Fascinating and terrifying. Luckily, you're in a position to be able to know to double check that. And not all users will be in that same position. I'm going to get to some more questions, lightning round, because we've got a bunch coming in. A question from William, and we've actually got a bunch of questions on this topic. He asks, is it time for people to take a serious look at scaling back their non-business use of social networking platforms?
Boy. Personal answer, yes, be very careful of it. Um, Longer answer is as long as you understand what you're getting yourself into, you're putting a lot of information out there that could be used by an adversary if they want to profile you, but is almost certainly being used by corporations around the world to create profiles of you. So understand what you're doing and the type of vulnerabilities you create. Um, but I think that is another horse that's out of the barn. I think it's good to teach some humility in how we use it. I worry more about, or equally about, the addictive element of it, even among us adults, than as much as I do about adversarial use. But it is definitely a huge platform. I wonder I guess it was William would think, where does LinkedIn fit in that? I've never used LinkedIn much until I left government at the end of this. I had a LinkedIn profile, and literally within hours of when I started at the White House before it was publicly announced, I had dozens of new friend requests. And when I dug in, many of whom had had accounts for days or hours.
Mhm.
So don't trust anything on it if you're going to use it. So I hope I answered William's question. It is something to be very suspicious about because, what do they say on the internet? No one knows you're a dog.
Okay. Question coming in from Tom. He asks, what emerging threats in the next few years will most test our resilience?
So number one is this edge devices, routers, and the living off the land techniques. The other issue that I think we are sleeping on is quantum computing and the impact that's going to have on cryptography. Um, that is a slow boil. We had actually been one of the reasons why I was so AI skeptical is we were just getting traction on dealing with this post-quantum cryptography problem, and then AI blew up, and that's all people wanted to talk about. So when there are AI computers at scale, all of our current cryptographic algorithms are going to be vulnerable. Thankfully, it's only going to probably be nation states that can use these computers initially. There are new algorithms that my old agency NIST has put out. It is a long and slow process to deploy those algorithms. It's not something we'll be able to do in a rush. And I'm worried that when we reach Q day or whatever you call it, it's going to blow up and we're going to be trying to put band-aids all over a big wound. So if you can work with your organizations, ask them, do they have a plan to migrate to post-quantum or quantum-resistant cryptography? NIST has put out the algorithms. There are products out there that use them. You have to do a significant amount of groundwork ahead of time to understand where and how you're using cryptography and where the algorithms are. But do that so you're ready to go, so you're not caught flat-footed if that day comes.
That's helpful. I think we're getting lots of good practical checklist items. A question coming in from Rudy in Pennsylvania. What do you think are some of the most overlooked cyber issues for businesses? Maybe you've already touched on some, but
PQC, post-quantum cryptography, I think is the biggest. Um, I think the training people in the human side of it is the part that I don't know if it's overlooked, but it's the one I think we need to double down on. Um, Patching and updating is another big one, which we all talk about, but none of myself included are as rigorous as we should be. If we're talking, I'm going to go really sort of nerd out. If you're talking about a information security function in an organization, the one tool that's out there that is phenomenal, my old agency, so I'm bragging a little, they created it without me. It's called the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Database. You get alerts every day if you're in the cyber world about be scared of this, be scared of that. This is the new thing. If something goes on, it's called the KEV. On the KEV, that means that it is a vulnerability that we know bad guys are exploiting, and that should immediately go to the top of your list. Get that done as quickly as possible. When I started at CISA, we turned it into we just KEV'd a vulnerability. And I had a briefing from our team like 48 hours later, and they walked in and said, we are only at 94% patch rate across the federal networks. And I'm like, what do you mean only? 94 is friggin' great. I'm like, no, no, no. We need to be at 99 at this point because these things are so high risk that we were driving it so hard. And when I got out into the private sector, I was surprised how few people realized the significance either of the KEV or some of the alerts that we put out from CISA.
that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I am looking at the clock and we are almost at the top of the hour. I feel like we could keep going for another 2 hours, but I want to close. Is there anything that you do individually in your personal life to keep yourself, cyber secure that maybe we haven't already touched on yet? And are there any other, besides your Substack, of course, any other best resources out there that people should be in tune to stay up to date on cyber threats?
So on the last point, Krebs on security is a phenomenal. He goes in deep in the weeds, but the first couple paragraphs, and you'll get good updates if you follow him on various social media. Most of the cyber companies, Mandiant, my old company Symantec, have a pretty good blog post. And then pay note when my old agency puts its label on an advisory. Excuse me, we put a lot of rigor into making sure that we were only labeling something if we had practical advice to give and it was a real threat. And you'll often see us along with FBI and others. In my personal space, the biggest thing, I try to ramp up my paranoia, but no matter, I still click on something at least every few months. I realize as my fingers coming up, I'm like, what did I just do? But I have the security tool on my phone. I have on my computers. One thing that I have gotten much better at in the past few months is using a VPN, a virtual private network, when I'm on unknown Wi-Fi. It can sometimes create some connectivity issues, but unfortunately, that is still a vehicle that attackers are using. And just be suspicious of things that either sound too good to be true or anything that tries to get your blood pressure up immediately. That is the criminal's tool, whether it is street crime or cybercrime.
Jeff, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your time and all your comments. This was, I'm sure, eye-opening. As I mentioned, had so many questions coming in. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you. We'd love to have you back in the future.
Love to come back. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Really eye-opening and fascinating stuff on cyber, and hopefully you got some good, helpful and practical tips for your organization, and as we just closed, in your personal life as well. As always, we're going to drop a link to our survey in the chat about today's program. So take a look and let us know what you thought. Give us some comments, and also let us know about the topics that you'd like to hear about in the future from a future session. We also have some great webinars coming up to close out the year, and we hope you'll join us for those. October is also National Manufacturing Month, and on October 15th, we're going to have part 3 in our series on mergers and acquisitions, this time with a close look at the manufacturing sector, so please tune into that. And if you've ever struggled with confidence while trying to negotiate or just want to improve your negotiation skills while being mindful of long-term relationships, we'll hope you'll join us on October 29th when Joan's going to sit down with Dr. John Burroughs from the University of Chicago for a mini masterclass in negotiation strategy. That's been a really popular topic on past programs. On November 12th, we'll be joined by VP and National Lead of Property Insurance, Angie Orban, for a deep dive into the evolving property insurance marketplace. That'll be a great one. Angie's terrific. And the following week, we'll have the CEO and co-founder of Spring Health, April Coe, and Traveler's very own Greg Landmark for a conversation on how employers can play a proactive role in improving mental well-being in America, and what employers and frontline managers can do within their teams to promote mental well-being at work. That's a topic that we've talked a lot about through our Forces at Work initiative, so we hope you'll join us for that as well. Lastly, you can listen to our webinar series on the go, as well as new original episodes on our Travelers Institute Risk and Resilience podcast, which is available on Google, Spotify, and Apple. Thank you again for tuning in this Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we hope you have a great afternoon.